Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. This episode is about the hate against the Romani people, or Antigypsyism. The Romani people were as much persecuted by the Nazis as the Jewish people were. We will discuss the shared experiences of extermination, our shared history of extermination of the Romani people and the Jewish people during the Holocaust and anti-Gypsyism today. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I decided to move to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Dembler Miller. I grew up in the Midwestern town of Elgin, Illinois, with very few Jews. We did not talk about the Holocaust. And yet, in September of 1970, my US Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Romani people were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and in other Nazi camps, along with the Jews. Today, 6 million Romani live in Europe and 1 million live in the United States. Many live elsewhere in the world. At most Holocaust commemorations in the Netherlands, where I am from, I remember Jews and Romani commemorating the Holocaust together. Our shared experiences bond our people together. We are thrilled to have Verena Meier as our guest today. Verena is a doctoral student at the Research Center on Antigypsyism at the University of Heidelberg. Her research focuses on historical anti-Gypsyism and anti-Semitism, National Socialism, minority history, as well as the history of ideas. She has worked for the Documentation and Cultural Center of German, Sinti, and Roma, the topography of terror, and the Saxon-Anhalt State Archives, and volunteered for the Domari Society of Gypsies in Jerusalem. Verena, welcome to our show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I get to ask the first question, although I would just like to add one thing. When Evelyn said that in Holland, the Netherlands, that Romani were frequently commemorated with Jewish Holocaust victims, I think I can speak fairly that in the United States, I've almost never heard the two combined. And it's only a pivotal experience I had when we lived in Germany, and I saw what we then called gypsies standing at Dachau, visiting the way we were. And then later with my work, I started becoming interested in what happened to the Romani, because otherwise I don't think in the United States I would be aware of it. That's one of the things we hope this program will share with our listeners, understanding how similar the two different peoples, I think that could be the correct word, experience. But here, my problem always says, start with definitions. Tell us which is the correct terms and the not correct terms. How do we refer to, so the memorial in Berlin is the memorial to the murdered Roma and Sinti people, or the victims of National Socialism. Again, Roma and Sinti. Okay, explain it all, please.
Yeah, it's a lot of confusion, and not many people, as you say, know any Sinti or Roma personally. Most people just know the stereotypes and prejudices about them, which are usually conceptualized in the negative term, so-called gypsy. And if we think of this notion of the stigmatization, we have a lot of images in our mind, which have been like, we grew up with them because they are in our children's books, they are in the movies, they are on postcards, so you find them everywhere. And in order to say, okay, that these people are not like the stereotypes, it's better to refer to the self-chosen term, and that's either Sinti or Roma. It's two different groups of people. Sometimes Romani people or Roma is used as an umbrella term for this whole minority in Europe, which is very, like if you look at the different countries in Europe, also the Netherlands and Germany, we are neighbors, but our cultures are different. And same with the Romani people, depending on where they live, they are very different. And the first mentioning of these people in Germany is from 1407 from Hildesheim. And the group of people that has lived in Germany since the medieval period is usually considered Sinti. And then the Roma in Germany, they are considered the ones who migrated in later waves of migration, for example, towards the end of the 19th century from Eastern Europe, or the 1950s, a so-called guest worker, or during the war in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So we have to make really sure that we differentiate between the negative stereotypes and the real people. But what's often done today is that there has been a semantic shift because people got aware, okay, this negative term should not be used anymore because it's stigmatizing, and it's we can also, like, there's hate speech and violence in our communication. So people avoid using this term, but they still keep the negative stereotypes and just project them on Sinti and Roma and use the politically correct description.
So we will refer in this episode not to gypsies, but to Romani.
Yeah.
And understand that it's actually several different tribes in several different countries that were using a group word the way Jews refers to Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, that we're using Romani as an umbrella.
Yeah, and if we speak of, like, because we're going to talk about the National Socialist persecution, which originated with this specific plan of exterminating the whole group of people that started in Germany. But this memorial is, and that's what a lot of people forget also, the memorial to the murdered Jews, it's to the murdered Jews of Europe, and same with the Sinti and Roma in Europe, because like Nazi occupation policy and the collaborating states, like the persecution spread throughout the Second World War. And then in the end, you mentioned Auschwitz-Birkenau, they were Sinti and Roma and other groups of Romani people from all over Europe.
Yes, who were murdered in Auschwitz, yes.
Verena, could you tell us briefly about the Nazi efforts to exterminate all Romani people?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you introduced me as a PhD student, and that's also the topic that I'm working on in my PhD thesis right now. I look at the local example of Magdeburg, how the genocide was implemented in a division of labor, but it was a state crime because, like, there were orders from the highest functionaries of the state, like Heinrich Himmler, chief of the police, for the persecution. And the criminal police is one institution that has a long tradition of persecuting and surveilling Sinti and Roma, because they always, along with this stigma that was ascribed to them, there was this notion of people who were mobile, who were traveling, who were crossing border, and the supposed criminalized activity was ascribed to them. So, like, there was a high interest of the criminal police already during the imperial period in Germany and the Weimar Republic to surveil these people, to take fingerprints of them, documentation, and exchange of information across police authorities in different states of Germany and throughout Europe. Actually, like the predecessor of Interpol, the International Criminal Police Commission, they also, like, one of their main topics was how to surveil Sinti and Roma and how the police authorities in Europe could work together. And that was in the 1920s already. And then what changed during the Nazi period, that the racial paradigms were taking over in the police work as well. And there's a very important decree from December 1938 by Heinrich Himmler. And he said that the so-called gypsy question should be solved by the essence of the race. And in this order, he institutionalized a cooperation of medical professionals who worked in the Reichsgesundheitsamt, Reich Health Office. And they had a specific section called Racial Hygiene Institute. And they worked with the criminal police together. And there you have also photos which have become iconic in several exhibitions where you see medical professionals, men and women. So in the English language, we don't need to mark the gender in, for example, perpetrator. In the German language, we need to do it. And sometimes it's forgotten that females also participated, but amongst these medical professionals and also in the criminal police, females participated as perpetrators. And you see photos where man and female from this medical research institute examine the bodies of persecuted Sinti and Roma. And they wrote so-called racial certificates in which they gave a diagnosis, in which they assessed a status of the so-called gypsy race, whether they were like mixed blooded gypsies in the Nazi language. And according to however they assessed the people, the criminal police then decided later on whether these people should be deported or not. And then there was the first wave of deportations, a round of deportations in West Germany in 1940 already towards occupied Poland. And that was closely related to the war in Western Europe and France. And then there was an order to deport all of the German Sinti and Roma in the spring of 1943. And those were the deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to the extermination camp, where a special area was created for the Sinti and Roma. And in these barracks, the persecuted and Auschwitz inmates could stay together with their family, which was different from, for example, the Jews who were incarcerated in Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Yes, I read about what's called at that time the Gypsy family camp. And Tio, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the summer of 44, I think August, when they needed those, the Nazis needed the barracks for the Hungarian Jews being deported, and they rounded up the Jews from the Gypsy family, they rounded up the Romani people from the Gypsy family camp and took them to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Is that correct?
Yes, there were several attempts also to what they called also liquidate the camp. And the first attempt, there was an uprising, and they weren't successful. But at that time, they already started also like bringing some of the inmates back to Germany, to the concentration camps, if they were assessed as being able to work. And then they were deported to camps like Buchenwald and then to their sub-camps. And then they had to do forced labor.
What got you interested? I want to ask you about what your research is right now at the University of Heidelberg a little bit more. But what got you interested in this field? Your background?
Yeah, so I studied in Heidelberg at the university, and I studied to become a high school teacher. And growing up in Germany and going through German school education, I thought when I started studying history, I thought I knew everything about the Holocaust and the Nazi persecution. And I was kind of, because I felt like the same stories were told over and over again, and I couldn't hear more in a way. And then I could have become a high school teacher and going through university education without any class in Holocaust studies. And I think that's kind of critical for the German teachers education, that it could be done like this. But in the last moments,
Wait, let me clarify. In
Mhm.
order to get a degree in education in Germany as a teacher, you have to have at least one Holocaust course. Is
No,
that what you're saying?
no,
Yeah.
you don't. It's not mandatory. So you could go through the University of Education without, and then like later on teach without having a solid knowledge.
Oh,
And I was
okay.
like
That's why I wanted to clarify.
about to do that, but then in the last year of my studies, I started dealing with the local history in my hometown in northern Germany, a small village, and then I got interested in the subject again. And then there was also one class about it was a commemoration event we organized, and later on an exhibition. And in these two classes and events, or what we organized, we looked at the deportation of the Heidelberg Jews in 1940, because they were deported. It was a special situation for the Jews in southwest of Germany. They were the first German Jews deported to Gurs in France. And
Right.
Heidelberg Jews amongst them. But in the same year, 1940, the Sinti and Roma of Heidelberg were also deported to occupied Poland. And so we dealt with that in a student exhibition. And then I got interested in this topic more. And in Heidelberg, there is a big documentation and cultural center of German Sinti and Roma, and they do exhibitions and cultural events. And then I started working as a student assistant, helping at this cultural center, and we created a traveling exhibition and an online exhibition, which I highly recommend to your listeners. It's www.sinti und, the German und, roma.org. And it's also in English, and there you find a lot of resources about the genocide of Sinti and Roma in Europe, and the time of struggling after 1945, because for a long time these this victim group was not recognized as victims of a special racial persecution by the Nazis.
How many Romani people were, about how many were killed by the Nazis?
Yeah, that's it's very hard to find the numbers, and there are historians trying to research that. So it's said between 200,000 and 500,000. Some even say less, but it's really hard to estimate, because same as with the persecution of the Jews, there was the Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe, and also there with the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, it's really hard to say how many were killed in mass shootings and who was killed. And the same with the Romani people, if there were mass shootings and there's no proof and no documents, no written records on them, which is because of the way the persecution happened in Eastern Europe. It's just a fact that there is very little documentation. So it's really hard to get the full, the accurate number.
Right. I found out when I made my documentary about anti-Semitism that if you look in the footage of the Dutch concentration camp Westerbork, where all the Jews were gathered before they were sent off to the extermination camps in Eastern Europe, the most known and used footage is of a girl standing in the door of the train. She's in the train, she wears a white headscarf, and then she has to go inside and the door closes and the train leaves. I only found out when I made my documentary and used that footage, it's in my documentary, that it's a Romani girl. It's not a Jewish girl, it's a Romani girl, and it's the most used footage about the Dutch concentration camp Westerbork. Our audience, if they are watching films or documentaries about the Holocaust and it's about Holland, that's what they will often see, a girl with a white headscarf in a train leaving for Eastern Europe. I think, Phyllis, my next question is already answered.
So I wanted to fast forward to now, because I know that Romani people have the same issues that Jews have today. Instead of anti-Semitism, it's anti-Gypsyism. And how does this manifest itself, and how do they have organizations that fight against it the way Jews do? And what can we as listeners do to help prevent continuing these stereotypes?
So from my experience, because we talked about the memorial to the murdered Sinti and Roma in Europe in Berlin. I'm a freelance tour guide for the Foundation to the Memorial of the Murdered Jews in Europe, and I take different groups, like school groups, but also adults, to this memorial. And what I recognize over and over again, that most people are not familiar with or not sensitive towards anti-Gypsyism. Anti-Gypsyism is reproduced without even blushing or getting red or like realizing that it's highly stigmatizing what's just said. And so when I give tours at this memorial, I invest most of the time deconstructing the negative prejudices and stereotypes most people have. And we cannot talk so much about history and the persecution anymore, because we're so much dealing with the sentiment that's still very strong. And so it is a form of discrimination which is found everywhere in all parts of the society. It's not specific to the left, specific to the right, and it's a form of discrimination that is people are saying discriminatory things without even realizing that it is so. And I think in terms of, like, if you compare it to anti-Semitism, there's a bit more awareness of what is anti-Semitic and what not, even though there's still a lot of anti-Semitism. But in contrast to anti-Gypsyism, it's, for most people, totally okay to say something negative about Sinti and Roma. And when I, in presentations and so on, when I talk 1 hour about like deconstructing these stereotypes, most people afterwards say, but I saw this one. I saw this family or so, and then they start arguing against me again. And so it is also a form, and that's also the same with anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and discrimination. It's not just on the level of ideas with images we have about so-called other people. It's not just about the words we use. It's embedded in deeper structures. And when people then say, yeah, but I know this one family in this and that town, and they live like this, and then they bring up all these negative stereotypes, then I always, first of all, ask, yeah, how do you know that they are Sinti and Roma? Because that's what's happening then, is again that they take these negative stereotypes that are connected to this stigmatization, the stigma of the so-called gypsy, and they just project it onto people, but now they use the politically correct term. And then they say, we don't know that they are Sinti and Roma. And I say, okay, so for me, that's a first sign that they are not fully aware of what is happening in the process of arguing against me. And then second, I always ask, okay, why do they live like this? Have you questioned it? Because if they are, for example, migrants coming from Eastern Europe and migrating to Germany for whatever reason, discrimination, poverty, persecution, whatever, and if like the authorities or the landlords in Germany project again like the negative stereotypes on them, they don't get a regular apartment. And then the authorities say, okay, it's this, and then they use the negative term again, it's this kind of a family. So they are okay if they live in the outskirts of the city, if they live close to the trash dump or so. And then all these negative images become manifest in social reality again, although the people themselves often, it's not inherent to them, but it's the social structures amongst them. And that's also a phenomenon of the past. A lot of Sinti and Roma were not mobile because it's in their genes that they were free-loving or freedom-loving spirits and always wanted to travel. It was because, like, if they tried to settle somewhere, a lot of communities said no, we don't give them a permanent living. And I found, like in my research for Magdeburg, it's very rarely that you find documents from the persecuted in the documentation of the perpetrators, because I deal with the documentation of the criminal police. And I found one letter from a woman from Quedlinburg, and she tried to release her husband and her sons from the concentration camp Buchenwald, because they were incarcerated in 1938, because they were described as so-called work shies. And she tried to release them, and she wrote like a letter. It's like reading this, it's so emotional, because she says, like, we tried to find a place to live here and there, and they were rejected everywhere. And she tried to find jobs for the husband. And so, like, the people were pushed into conditions that kind of were on par with the stereotypes. But it's not like because of who they are, but it's because of the discrimination in the dominant society.
Now,
Can you educate us a little bit about the type of stereotype? Our audience is probably familiar with stereotypes about Jews, but could you educate us a little bit about?
Yeah, like one stereotype is ascribed criminality, and I told you about the criminal police, that they were surveilling them for a long time because of this attribute that was ascribed to them. But the same stereotype, for example, if we talk about the time after 1945 and the survivors, once they tried to become recognized as victims of a National Socialist persecution, of a racial persecution, and I quoted, or I like referred to Himmler's decree from 1938, where he really said, by the essence of the race. But the authorities after 1945, when it came to compensation and being recognized as victims, they denied them the recognition and the compensation, saying, yeah, but they were incarcerated rightfully in their view, because they were so-called asocials or criminals. And still today, like I know people who belong to the community and who maybe work in banks, and they don't identify as a Rom or a Sinto, because they say, if we do so, like, these stereotypes and negative images are projected onto me again. And if something goes wrong in the bank, it doesn't matter what the real problem was. The scapegoat will always be him, just because of people know who he is. And that causes, it's not a problem, but this kind of mismatch, like, people just know about the negative stereotypes of so-called gypsies, but they don't know real Sinti and Roma. And real Sinti and Roma do not want to identify as such because of a fear of further discrimination. And then the view of the dominant society, again, cannot really change, because they don't see that. And it's also, I do a lot of education programs against anti-Semitism too. And in the end, we always do an evaluation. So what have you learned? And in the end, all the students always say, yeah, I learned that they are normal people like us. And it's shocking, but it's, yeah, it just shows that direct contact and seeing real people who do not match the stereotypes that are so dominant is so crucially important for yeah, education programs against all kinds of isms and prejudices. And in social psychology, it's called direct contact hypothesis, that the direct contact is the best way of combating prejudices.
In German schools, I'm not talking below the college level, is there a unit, I'm trying to explain, Romani people to bring them up to a level of understanding that it's normal and that the Jews are normal? Or are they totally overlooked in schools?
Well, when I went to school, I'm in my early 30s now, there was no such unit. And it's changing a bit now also, that they include, for example, the genocide of Sinti and Roma under the Nazis, but also the civil rights movement as a because the Sinti and Roma protested after 1945 against the continuing discrimination and non-recognition as survivors. And that is being done more and more. But I also see a real problem that still, like when we teach like the Shoah or like now the genocide of the Sinti and Roma, often in history books, the sources are taken from the past. And if it's like an image by the Stürmer or so, teachers usually critically deconstruct this image during the lesson, 45 hours. And then students leave and they know, okay, that was the like Nazi image, but still what's left is this negative image. And there's not a lot of education or exchanges in the formal school education with real people. And also when it comes to Jews, it's very limited to the Shoah and not the long history of like last year. You also did an interview, I saw it, about the festival, 1,700 years of Jewish history of Jews in Germany. And also like the state of like Jews in Germany today, or this Israel. It's not really talked in German school books.
Very interesting. Evelyn, do you have a last question before we give our guests a chance to have last words?
Yes, Verena, how can our listeners recognize offensive Romani characterization and speak up against it?
Mm-hmm. So I already said earlier, it's not only about what is being said, it's also structurally, but what's done a lot is, for example, that the images are used and romanticized also. Like, so just if you post pictures, also if it's, and it's done in also scientific journals or newspaper articles, that still like these negative images are posted, they contribute to the tradition of these stereotypes in our minds, basically. Always, no matter whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-Gypsyism, if you realize that something is said, speak up. And like for me, I realized—
How can they recognize it? How can they, what should they look for?
Mm-hmm. So usually it's in other codes. So for example, they don't use the term so-called gypsy in quotation marks, but they use all the attributes to it, and then they homogenize the whole group. For example, they say they are all still traveling. It's not true. And I, for example, I did this traveling exhibition, and then people said, oh, traveling exhibition, that's fitting for Sinti and Roma. And that's something which is, yeah, where you could speak up and deconstruct these attributes that are still there.
I would like to give, I already told Evelyn, it might sound minor, but I've corrected this for 20 or more years. The word that Americans say all the time. They say the word he gypped me. And I very nicely say to them, do you realize that it's offensive? It comes from the word gypsy, and it's I won't give you the whole spiel here. And I say the correct word in English is he cheated me.
Yeah.
That's a case of where most Americans, if you went out on the street now and you asked them if they knew what that word meant, anywhere it came from, they would have no idea. But once you know what the word means, very nicely, I don't yell at people. I just say, don't you realize what that word says? So it's an education process.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's as you said, because here again we have the notions or the attributes in this word itself, and the word is still used. And as you said, most people don't even realize the dimensions of it and all the discrimination behind it. But also with the term so-called gypsy, there was a TV show last year in Germany, and it was a big controversy because like celebrities or so-called celebrities were discussing what kind of words should still be used, should not still be used. And they also talked about this, and it's still in a lot of menus from the Netherlands. You should also know it. Maybe there is like a form of schnitzel that's called like this, or there's a kind of sauce that's called like this. And so it's good to be aware of the discrimination within the language. But what I tried to say in the beginning, it doesn't also always help to be like sensitive to the language only, because if all the negative prejudices and stereotypes still persist, even though we use the politically correct terms, then it's not enough to just change the language then.
Yes, absolutely.
So what people should look for is use the right term for the people, and which is Romani or Roma, Sinti, depending on which tribe or group of.
Yeah, and not homogenize. I mean, homogenize, we do it a lot, this us versus them, and then creating the image of an other. And also with the
other and the image of people always who don't settle, and the image of people who are criminal. And those are the things to watch out for, because those are the typical stereotypes.
Exactly, and these stereotypes, they are still there, and they are there in like describing the people, even when the term is not used.
Yeah.
Last words, last thoughts of how you can help our listeners, because it's all connected. Allowing people to say stereotypical things about Romani people is, to me and Evelyn, the same as allowing people to say stereotypes about Jews. So we need to all work together to protect each other's different groups and get people to stop hating each other. So what are your last words?
So I told you I want to give you one fact and one quote. We talked about the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, and it's interesting that you started this talk with your perspectives from the Netherlands and the US, and I totally agree that in the US there's the lack of knowledge is still much bigger than in Europe. But there has been a study, it's called MEMO study. It's on the commemoration culture in Germany, and they interviewed not just young people, like different age groups, and almost 70% of the interviews could not name any place connected to the murder of the Sinti and Roma under the National Socialism that commemorates it. And this could be Auschwitz-Birkenau, it could be any concentration camp, it could be the National Memorial, which, by the way, is this month. It celebrates its 10th anniversary, because it was built on 24th of October 2012. So after 10 years, almost 70% cannot name this, but it also, like the study shows, that also the Germans have a blind spot when it comes to the crimes Germans committed in Eastern Europe, especially Belarus and Ukraine. And a lot of the younger generations, or like the generations who didn't live in that time, they answered in this survey that they think that their relatives who lived during the Nazi dictatorship were amongst the victims and not amongst the perpetrators, bystanders, or profiteers. And so that says a lot about the German society today also, and dealing with these kind of crimes. And it's very different for the people, like the Jewish relatives and ancestors, but also for the Sinti and Roma. And I would like to end with one quote by a survivor. He's called Reinhard Florian, and he published his memoirs also in 2012. And he wrote, I quote, "For me personally, nothing will change anymore. My reality, my life are all dominated by this brutal past. And the older I become, the more it comes to my mind. I can't cast off these atrocities like a soiled shirt. But looking to the future, to the generations to come, we should stop bringing people up to be murderers, racists, and imbeciles."
Very powerful quote. Thank you so much for coming on our program. I thank our listeners for listening. And anyone who has not yet seen Evelyn's powerful documentary, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can learn more about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater play, thinedgeofthewedge.com. And everyone, whenever you can, without putting yourself in physical danger, please speak up against anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, and all hate.